Hey, what's up? This is Asuka here. Something that we've talked about on this channel before is how hashtag Techwear on Instagram and now on TikTok has changed to the point that it doesn't always necessarily reflect what techwear clothing was initially about. Techwear has almost become a catch-all term for a bunch of different styles, confusing as that can be. But nowadays people are starting to be a bit more forthcoming with using different terms to describe some of these different aesthetics. Not just techwear, but darkwear and warcore as well, and some attempts made to explaining the differences between them. But it feels like there's a bit of a lack of clarity around some of these terms, with even some of the people explaining them not always fully understanding them. So I want to take this opportunity to go a little bit more in detail about the aesthetic subgenre of warcore. We'll talk about the rise and the emergence of this term and style, how it's most commonly used and seen today, and how warcore could evolve and help legitimize itself. All of that to answer the question, what is warcore anyway? The term warcore gained traction around 2017-2018 and was used in two distinct places. Firstly, and probably best known, it was used to describe those high fashion brands which started to incorporate more overt military elements in their design. Of course, using military inspiration in fashion is absolutely nothing new. Some of the most famous collections of all time, like the Raf Simons 2001 Riot collection, has very clear, obvious military references. But this represented a new resurgence, with brands like Alix as the poster child, popularizing not only the military-grade Cobra buckle, which ended up being used in absolutely everything from jewelry to hats, but also the chest rig, which aesthetically is not too different to the kind of thing that soldiers on the battlefield would wear for easier access to magazines and tools and other kinds of things. Wear from influential celebrities like Kanye and Drake was really all it took to cause an explosive wave of popularity for this accessory. At a similar time, other brands like a Cold Wall were also incorporating more obvious military details in their clothing. Essentially, we're talking about greater and more obvious adoption of military motifs by luxury fashion brands. Understandably, this drew criticism from people feeling like it was commodifying and glamorizing war, but that's a whole nother topic. At the same time, albeit more underground, terms like warcore, terrorwave, and milspo were being used on image boards like 4chan to share images of military-inspired fashion. Despite the same word being used here, the content was very different, with far closer links to actual war. You'd be much more likely to see pictures of actual insurgents or military uniforms, both past and present, than you would runway pictures and high fashion brands. And similarly, discussion of individual pieces and outfits weren't centered around luxury fashion brands, but genuine military surplus or vintage gear. The result is that often these looks were far more rooted in vintage style. Some examples were essentially military dress-up, but it also showed how genuine military gear could be recontextualized into streetwear style. Despite these two sources of the word warcore only popping up 4 or 5 years ago, content around this term has changed. There are some similarities, but a lot of differences too. Content now is very clearly defined, with a lot of recurring elements between outfits. All black, of course, is a given, but also something that's really important is the very heavy use of accessories. Key clips, leg holsters, chest rigs, plate carriers, all of these things are used in abundance and often all at once. In extreme cases, this is combined with gear exclusively designed for combat, knee and elbow pads, body armor, and of course weaponry-based props like airsoft guns and samurai swords. Another thing you'll see quite commonly is the inclusion of non-military accessories, things like goth or eboy influenced jewelry and chains. And yes, this is exactly the kind of look that I poked fun of a year or two ago in that hashtag Techwear video. The accessories are a key part of 2021 warcore and tend to be what get the most attention, but the things underneath that, those base pieces, have definitely changed as well. Cargo pants and outerwear pieces like jackets and anoraks are still extremely common. But it's rare to see those come from fashion brands. Alix, a Cold Wall, Kotweiler, those kinds of brands which seemed so essential a few years ago, now now are very rarely seen at all. Instead, things from AliExpress, Taobao, Amazon, and the various dropshippers that resell those products are far more commonly seen. They provide future military or utilitarian looks at fast fashion prices, albeit sacrificing product quality, history and authenticity, and original design. Note also that unlike with Techwear, clothing which fits into the Warcore aesthetic is less concerned with utility, performance, and wearability, but the appearance of those things. That's partly why these fast fashion items are more commonplace, because those comfort and wearability aspects, which are difficult to communicate in a TikTok or an Instagram post and make clothing more expensive, is often put to one side. There are of course brands that exist specifically to cater to this kind of aesthetic, and interestingly they're often more maximalist than your conventional military gear. Take a brand like Holy Grail for example, who have been a mainstay of this kind of aesthetic for years. You have not only heavily branded clothing, but also loads of extraneous straps and other kinds of details that you probably wouldn't find on an actual pair of BDUs. MXDVS have a huge range of exactly the type of accessories favoured by Warcore fans with quite prominent branding, and Fabric of the Universe produce very maximalist, heavily branded clothing with very clear cyberpunk and dystopian influences in their graphics. You could even add Doom Life in here, Scarlord's brand, which of course we've covered on the channel before. Warcore in the TikTok and Instagram era, if we look at how some of these brands present themselves, is as much a fusion of military fetishism and eboy, goth, metal kind of aesthetics than it is a pure replication of military influenced clothing that the name Warcore might suggest. And in those cases we talked about before with body armor and weaponry and stuff like that, there's a definite overlap with cosplay culture as well, where the focus is more about creating a character and a costume than it is documenting what people are wearing on a particular day. Because walking around with body armor and a weapon in most built up areas is probably going to get you arrested. Hopefully now you have an idea of what this style is about and how it differs aesthetically and conceptually to other things like Techwear. Personally, I'm happy this term is being used more for these kinds of outfits, just for the sake of clarity and being able to more accurately describe two different things which have not only different aesthetics, but different influences and audiences. One question remains though: how can Warcore as an aesthetic or genre progress or evolve in the future? There is a frequent question of Warcore's legitimacy as a fashion style, to the point that it's sometimes described as sort of existing outside of fashion in a separate space to techwear, avant-garde, brutalism, all those other kinds of aesthetics which have something visually in common with Warcore. So I'll give some potential reasons for that, and personally how I feel this genre could evolve to help address them. Firstly, some people take the view that Warcore is just like a stepping stone to techwear or other kinds of styles. Often younger people or people who don't want to spend the associated cost or the time learning more about performance fashion often see Warcore as a way of getting some of those aesthetics more easily and at a cheaper price. That explains the trend towards very cheap dropshipped clothing or military replica stuff off Amazon. And that's what people mean when they tend to talk about Warcore as existing outside the traditional fashion space. A lot of the people who start gaining an interest in this style don't have much knowledge or even an interest in fashion generally. And when they do, or if they do, develop that interest, they tend to graduate on to a different style of fashion. However, as we've seen earlier, there are plenty of established brands with a more direct relationship to Warcore, and I do think there's space for that to exist separately to Techwear. Aleeks, Kotweiler, A Cold Wall, and plenty more are all relatively unexplored terrain in the current Warcore space, and it would be a great way of evolving this aesthetic beyond the AliExpress clothing. Even if people aren't going to go running down the shops to buy loads of high fashion clothing, even learning more about those kinds of brands gives people more context and a better understanding of how these kinds of military motifs have been used or could be used in fashion. I would also love to see Warcore as a subculture take greater interest in the relationship between fashion and military clothing generally, as well as finding new or interesting ways to recontextualize military or military influenced clothing. There are Instagram accounts out there like It's Nothing New, which are very cool resources for that kind of thing, and there's a huge amount to learn which extends far beyond surface level similarities and comparisons between military clothing and current day fashion. Incorporating more authentic military gear could definitely satisfy the cosplay cosplay focused creators who could use that stuff to make some really cool, quite outlandish looks, but also give something new for the more casual fans to understand, get to grips with, and incorporate into their style. Even from my own perspective, doing the research for that bomber jacket video really only scratched the surface of what is something that's really, really interesting. I want to hear stories of people's awesome vintage finds and how they've been able to incorporate this really unusual piece of military gear in their own style, not just buying the same anorak that they've seen other people wearing on Instagram. That brings me to a third point. Since Warcore in its current form is a very well-defined aesthetic with lots of recurring pieces, look at those Holy Grail cargos for example, there is a risk of stagnation and that kind of fading away. You only need to compare to the eboy style, which had its day in the sun for maybe about a year and has just kind of fallen off. Both the areas of fashion and military that I described before I think are adequate solutions to this problem, just incorporating more influences from different places. But I would also give the same advice that I think about with any kind of style or subculture, be that warcore, techwear, streetwear, anything. Don't let those kinds of terms create a neat box that you 100% need to fit in all of the time. Instead of setting out to build a warcore outfit or dress more warcore, think about how you could incorporate some of those warcore items or things which have that kind of look into your own style. For example, a very overtly warcore looking bomber or some military jacket of some kind could actually work really well styled in a more minimalist way, and that becomes a real statement piece. Or maybe some of those warcore accessories could be used to make a hikercore look a little more kind of utilitarian or futuristic in some way. There are loads of different ways that you could experiment with stuff like this. And I know that there's a lot of pressure to kind of fit in or to conform to a sort of uniform of a particular community, but at the end of the day, people love seeing individuality and creativity. So I would definitely not be scared to do things that feel a little bit different to the current status quo. And as I say, that applies to absolutely everything, not just this particular style. So that's Warcore in my eyes. I've tried to be as fair and as comprehensive as I can be. Please remember as well, this is absolutely not intended to be a sort of personal attack or criticism on how individual people dress or anything like that. It's just an area where I feel a lack of information definitely exists, particularly on platforms like TikTok, where it can be very difficult to explain these kinds of concepts in like a 15-second video. Would love to hear your take on the world of Warcore and where you think it fits in the fashion landscape. Is there some cool stuff in here? Is it pure cringe? Is there potential for this relatively new aesthetic to develop and evolve over time? And does it even matter whether you're wearing techwear or warcore or pastel goth Lolita cosplay? You decide. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like. It is super appreciated. And of course, let me know if you enjoyed this topic, you want to see more content around this kind of thing. I'm always up for doing a big variety of stuff. And that is everything from me. So again, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next week with another video. Shout out to Mr. Liquid Death, who also picked up a pair of the ACG Nasu 2 and has already been putting them through their paces. Really appreciate the extra information. They're definitely going to be helpful for people. And yeah, it sounds like they've done pretty well for you. And shout out to everyone for your support over on TikTok. We got to spread the good word of Techwear over there too. Going to make some slightly different content, the kind of short form fun stuff, outfits, little comedy things, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, if you want to see a little bit more, you can go over there and you'll find that. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. If you want to catch some more, there's going to be links going up at the top. And if you haven't subscribed yet, then definitely consider doing so, because we've got more techwear related content. Maybe we'll have some warcore outfits or something as well. Who knows? Yeah, keep an eye out. There's going to be loads more videos on the way.